What happens when two of Britain's most outspoken personalities collide in a war of words that nobody saw coming? In just 46 seconds, a friendly chat turned into one of the most shocking meltdowns in talk show history. Before we dive into this absolute chaos, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. We bring you daily videos exposing Hollywood's darkest scandals, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Last night, on the Jonathon Show, what started as lighthearted banter between the host and comedian Ricky Gervais quickly spiraled into something nobody in that studio could have predicted. The tension in the room became so thick you could cut it with a knife, and by the end, Gervais was storming off set, leaving Ross and the entire audience in stunned silence. The evening began innocently enough. Gervais walked onto the set with his usual confident swagger, waving to the cheering crowd as he made his way to the guest chair. Ross greeted him with a big smile and a handshake, and for the first few minutes, everything seemed perfectly normal. They joked about Gervais's recent Netflix special, laughed about his obsession with his cat, and poked fun at each other the way old friends do. But then, Ross decided to bring up a topic that would change the entire mood of the interview. He leaned forward in his chair, that mischievous grin spreading across his face, and said he wanted to talk about some comments Gervais had made on social media the week before. The audience went quiet, sensing something was about to happen. Gervais's smile faded slightly. He shifted in his seat and asked what comments Ross was referring to. Ross explained that Gervais had tweeted something controversial about certain celebrities, suggesting they weren't as talented as people thought they were. He named a few of the celebrities Gervais had apparently called out, and the audience gasped. Gervais didn't back down. He shrugged and said he was just being honest, that someone needed to say what everyone was thinking. He argued that comedy is about truth, and if people can't handle the truth, that's their problem, not his. His voice was getting louder, more defensive, and you could see his jaw tightening as he spoke. Ross laughed it off at first, trying to keep things light. He said something like, "Well, that's very you, isn't it? Always stirring the pot." But there was an edge to his voice now, a hint that he wasn't entirely joking anymore. He pressed further, asking if Gervais ever worried about going too far, about hurting people's feelings just for the sake of a joke. That's when Gervais's expression changed completely. His eyes narrowed, and he sat up straighter in his chair. He told Ross that he didn't need a lecture about comedy from someone who built a career on being safe and playing it careful. The audience let out a collective, "Ooh," and you could feel the atmosphere in the studio shift dramatically. Ross's smile vanished. He stared at Gervais for a moment, clearly taken aback by the personal attack. Then he fired back, saying at least he knew how to have guests on his show without making them uncomfortable, unlike some people who seemed to think being rude was the same thing as being funny. His voice was sharp now, cutting through the tension like a blade. Gervais let out a harsh laugh and said that was rich coming from someone whose show had been losing viewers for years. He suggested that maybe Ross was just jealous that other comedians were more successful and more relevant than he was. The words hung in the air like poison, and the audience didn't know whether to gasp or stay silent. Ross's face turned red. He leaned forward, pointing his finger at Gervais, and said he'd had enough of the disrespect. He told Gervais that he'd invited him onto the show as a friend, and this was how he was being repaid. His voice was shaking with anger now, and you could tell he was genuinely hurt by what Gervais had said. But Gervais wasn't done. He stood up from his chair, towering over Ross's desk, and said maybe the problem was that Ross couldn't handle someone who didn't kiss his ass like all his other guests did. He said he was tired of pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't, and he wasn't going to sit there and be lectured about how to do his job. The audience was completely silent now. You could hear people shifting uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what to do or how to react. Some of the crew members were looking at each other with wide eyes, clearly wondering if they should step in and stop what was happening. Ross stood up too, his face still flushed with anger. He told Gervais that if he wanted to leave, he should just bloody leave then. He said he didn't need someone who couldn't have a civil conversation without turning it into a personal attack. His voice was loud now, echoing through the studio, and you could see his hands were trembling slightly. Gervais stared at him for a long moment, and for a second, it looked like he might actually apologize or sit back down. But then he shook his head and said he was done with this. He called the whole thing a joke and said he had better things to do than waste his time on a show that nobody watched anymore. The insult landed hard, and you could see Ross flinch. That was the final straw. Ross pointed toward the exit and told Gervais to get off his set. His voice was firm and commanding, leaving no room for argument. He said he didn't care who Gervais thought he was or how famous he was. Nobody talked to him like that on his own show. The words were final, absolute, and everyone in the studio knew there was no coming back from this. Gervais laughed again, but this time it was bitter and angry. He ripped off his microphone and threw it onto the chair behind him. He muttered something under his breath that the cameras didn't quite catch, but you could tell from his expression it wasn't anything nice. He started walking toward the exit, his footsteps heavy and deliberate on the studio floor. Ross called after him, saying that this was exactly why people were tired of him, why his act was getting old. He said Gervais could dish it out, but he couldn't take it. And that was the mark of a bully, not a comedian. His voice was shaking with emotion, a mixture of anger and disappointment that was painful to watch. Gervais stopped walking for just a moment. He turned his head slightly, as if he was going to say something back, but then he seemed to think better of it. He shook his head again and continued toward the exit, his shoulders tense and his fists clenched at his sides. You could see the anger radiating off him with every step he took. The audience didn't know what to do. Some people started clapping awkwardly, while others just sat there in shocked silence, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. The crew members were frozen in place, their cameras still rolling, but nobody quite sure what they were supposed to be filming anymore. Ross stood behind his desk, watching Gervais walk away. His chest was heaving, and you could see he was trying to compose himself. He ran a hand through his hair and turned back to face the audience, attempting to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He looked exhausted, drained by the confrontation that had just unfolded. As Gervais reached the edge of the stage, he paused one more time. He looked back at Ross with an expression that was hard to read. Was it regret? Anger? Defiance? Nobody could quite tell. But then he turned away again and disappeared behind the curtain, leaving the studio in stunned silence. Ross tried to salvage what was left of the show. He made a weak joke about things getting a bit heated, and a few people in the audience laughed nervously, but it was clear that nobody knew quite how to react. The energy in the room had been completely shattered, replaced by an uncomfortable tension that seemed to hang over everything. He attempted to move on, saying they had other guests waiting and the show must go on, but his voice lacked its usual enthusiasm. You could tell he was shaken by what had happened, that the confrontation had affected him more deeply than he wanted to admit. His hands were still trembling slightly as he shuffled the cards on his desk. The crew tried to help, playing upbeat music and cutting to commercial break, but the damage was done. Everyone who had been in that studio had witnessed something they wouldn't soon forget. It was raw, it was real, and it was absolutely brutal. The kind of moment that would be talked about for years to come. When Ross came back from the commercial break, he looked more composed, but there was still a sadness in his eyes. He thanked the audience for their patience and tried to joke about the drama, saying that's what happens when you put two opinionated people in the same room. But his voice was hollow, and you could tell his heart wasn't in it. He introduced his next guest, trying desperately to inject some normalcy back into the show, but the shadow of what had happened with Gervais loomed over everything. The audience was still processing the confrontation, still replaying the angry words and the shocking exit in their minds. It was impossible to just move on as if nothing had happened. Behind the scenes, you could only imagine what was going through everyone's minds. The producers were probably panicking, wondering if they should cut the segment entirely or leave it in for the drama. The crew members were likely gossiping about what they'd witnessed, sharing their shock and disbelief with each other, and Gervais himself was presumably somewhere backstage or already in his car, fuming about what had transpired. But back in the studio, Ross was doing his best to finish the show with some dignity intact. He went through the motions with his remaining guests, asking questions and laughing at jokes, but there was a weariness to him now. The confrontation had taken its toll, and you could see it in every forced smile and every tired gesture. The audience could feel it too. They clapped when they were supposed to clap and laughed when they were supposed to laugh, but their hearts weren't really in it either. They were still thinking about the explosive argument they'd witnessed, still wondering what had caused two friends to turn on each other so viciously. It was the kind of television moment that burns itself into your memory. As the show wound down toward its conclusion, Ross seemed eager to wrap things up. He thanked his guests with less fanfare than usual, and thanked the audience for being there, but you could tell he just wanted the night to be over. The usual energy and excitement that characterized his show had been completely drained by the confrontation with Gervais. When the cameras finally stopped rolling and the show officially ended, Ross slumped back in his chair. The fake smile he'd been maintaining for the audience finally dropped, and you could see the exhaustion written all over his face. He'd just been through one of the most difficult moments of his career, and it showed in every line of his expression. The audience slowly filed out of the studio, buzzing with conversation about what they'd witnessed. People were pulling out their phones, probably texting their friends and family about the crazy confrontation they'd just seen live. Some were shaking their heads in disbelief, while others were excitedly recounting their favorite moments from the argument. Back on stage, the crew began the process of breaking everything down for the night. They moved around Ross quietly, giving him space to collect himself after the ordeal. You could tell they felt bad for him, that they understood how difficult it must have been to have a guest turn on him like that in front of everyone. Meanwhile, Gervais had long since left the building. Security confirmed he'd stormed out to his waiting car without saying a word to anyone, his face still dark with anger. He'd gotten into the back seat and slammed the door, and the car had sped off into the night. Nobody knew what he was thinking or feeling in that moment, but it was clear he had no regrets about his dramatic exit. The makeup of what had happened was still settling in everyone's minds. Two men who had once been friendly had torn each other apart on live television over what started as a simple question about social media comments. It had escalated so quickly, so dramatically, that nobody could quite believe it had really happened. The argument had revealed something deeper, though, something that had clearly been brewing beneath the surface for a while. These weren't just heat-of-the-moment insults thrown around carelessly. There was real hurt behind those words, real resentment that had been building up over time. The confrontation had simply been the breaking point where everything came flooding out. Ross had accused Gervais of being a bully who couldn't take criticism. Gervais had accused Ross of being jealous and irrelevant. Both men had struck at the deepest insecurities of the other, knowing exactly where to aim their words for maximum damage. It was brutal and uncomfortable to watch, but undeniably compelling. The personal nature of the attacks had made it clear this wasn't just about a difference of opinion on comedy or social media behavior. This was about ego, about pride, about two strong personalities clashing in the most public way possible. Neither man had been willing to back down or admit they might be wrong, and that stubbornness had led to the explosive conclusion. For Ross, being told his show was losing viewers and that he was playing it safe must have cut deep. He'd built his career on being edgy and provocative, on pushing boundaries and making people uncomfortable in a good way. To have Gervais suggest he'd lost that edge, that he'd become boring and irrelevant, was perhaps the worst insult he could have received. And for Gervais, being called a bully and accused of going too far with his comedy must have struck a nerve as well. He'd always prided himself on being honest and unfiltered, on saying what others were too afraid to say. To have that quality reframed as cruelty rather than bravery, as bullying rather than truth-telling, must have felt like an attack on his entire identity as a comedian. The fact that these insults came from each other, from two men who presumably knew each other well and understood exactly what would hurt the most, made it all the more painful to witness. This wasn't some random celebrity feud between strangers. This was a falling out between people who had once respected each other, maybe even considered each other friends. The audience members walking out of the studio that night knew they'd witnessed something special, even if special meant shocking and uncomfortable. They'd seen the masks come off, seen two public figures drop their carefully maintained personas and reveal the raw, angry, hurt human beings underneath. It was the kind of unscripted drama that you simply couldn't fake. As word spread about what had happened, people who hadn't been in the studio would watch clips online and try to piece together exactly what had gone wrong. They'd analyze every word, every facial expression, every gesture, looking for clues about the deeper issues at play. The 46 seconds of chaos would be replayed and discussed endlessly. But for those who had been there in person, who had felt the tension in the room and watched it escalate in real time, no amount of analysis or commentary could truly capture what it had felt like. The shock of watching two professionals lose control, the discomfort of being trapped in your seat as the argument grew more heated, the uncertainty of not knowing how it would end, those were experiences you had to live through to fully understand. The studio lights were dimming now, the last of the equipment being packed away. The stage where the confrontation had taken place looked empty and lifeless. All the energy and anger that had filled it just a short time ago completely dissipated. But the memory of what had happened there would linger, in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it, and in the clips that would inevitably make their way onto social media. Ross finally stood up from his chair and walked off the set without looking back. His shoulders were slumped, and he moved slowly, like someone much older than his years. The confrontation had clearly taken a lot out of him, leaving him drained and probably questioning how things had gone so wrong so quickly. Somewhere in the building, producers were already having emergency meetings about how to handle the situation. Should they air the segment as is? Should they edit it down? Should they release a statement explaining what happened? These were difficult questions with no easy answers, because no matter what they decided, the confrontation would be the story everyone was talking about. The thing about live television is that you can't take back what's already been said. Those words that Gervais and Ross had hurled at each other couldn't be unsaid. The anger and hurt couldn't be erased. Once it was out there, it was permanent, captured forever on camera for anyone to see and judge. For Gervais, sitting in his car on the way home, the adrenaline was probably starting to wear off. He might have been replaying the argument in his mind, thinking about what he'd said and whether he'd gone too far. Or maybe he was still too angry to think clearly, still convinced he'd been right to stand up for himself and walk out when he did. For Ross, likely heading home himself after the show wrapped, the emotions were probably even more complex. He'd been insulted on his own show, forced to kick out a guest in front of his audience. His professional pride had been wounded, and his personal feelings had been hurt. The confrontation had probably left him feeling angry, embarrassed, and sad all at once. The other guests who had appeared on the show after Gervais left probably didn't know what to make of what they'd witnessed either. They'd come expecting a fun, lighthearted talk show experience, and instead, they'd walked into the aftermath of a major confrontation. Some of them probably felt uncomfortable, while others might have been secretly thrilled to have been part of such a dramatic moment. The audience members were now spreading out into the London night, heading home or to pubs, where they'd no doubt recount the story to anyone who would listen. "You won't believe what I just saw on the Jonathon Ross show," they'd say, and then they'd describe the argument in vivid detail, probably embellishing parts of it to make the story even more dramatic. Back in the empty studio, the only sound was the echo of footsteps as the last crew members finished their work and headed out. The stage sat dark and quiet, giving no indication that just hours earlier it had been the site of one of the most explosive confrontations in talk show history. But the camera footage remained, preserved evidence of a friendship publicly destroyed. The green room where Gervais had probably waited before the show was empty, now too. His water bottle might still have been sitting on a table, his phone charger still plugged into the wall. Small signs that he'd been there before everything went wrong. Someone would have to collect those items and figure out how to get them back to him, an awkward task nobody would want. In television, these kinds of moments are rare but unforgettable. When they happen, they remind everyone watching that beneath the polish and preparation, these are real people, with real emotions and real conflicts. The carefully controlled environment of a talk show can only contain so much tension before it explodes. And tonight, the tension between Gervais and Ross had reached its breaking point. The confrontation had started over something relatively small, a question about social media comments, but it had quickly revealed much deeper issues. Old resentments, professional jealousies, personal slights that had been accumulating over time, all came pouring out in a torrent of angry words. Once the floodgates opened, there was no stopping it. What made it particularly shocking was how quickly things had escalated. One moment they were joking around like old friends, and the next they were at each other's throats, hurling insults designed to inflict maximum damage. The speed of the transformation from friendly to hostile was almost whiplash-inducing for those watching. The audience had come expecting entertainment, and they'd certainly gotten it, just not the kind they'd anticipated. Instead of rehearsed jokes and pleasant small talk, they'd witnessed genuine conflict, real anger, and authentic hurt feelings. It was uncomfortable and awkward, but it was also compelling in a way that scripted drama could never be. As the night wore on and the initial shock began to fade, people would start forming opinions about who was right and who was wrong. Some would side with Gervais, arguing that Ross had provoked him with unnecessary questions and deserved what he got. Others would side with Ross, insisting that Gervais had overreacted and behaved badly as a guest on someone else's show. But the truth was probably more complicated than either of those narratives. Both men had contributed to the confrontation. Both had said things they might later regret. Both had let their emotions override their professionalism. It was a situation where there were no clear heroes or villains, just two flawed human beings having a very public argument. The recording of the show sat on servers somewhere. The footage of the confrontation preserved in perfect quality. Editors would soon be poring over every second of it, trying to decide what could be aired and what should be cut. But no amount of editing could change what had actually happened in that studio, the raw reality of the confrontation. Security guards were doing their final rounds of the building now, checking that everything was locked up and secure for the night. They'd probably been briefed about what had happened, warned that there might be press or fans trying to get inside for information. The confrontation between Gervais and Ross had turned the studio into a site of intense interest. Outside, the London streets were quiet, the city settling into its late-night rhythm. But inside the homes of everyone who had been part of the show that night, the events were still being processed, still being discussed. Spouses and roommates were being told the story. Friends were being called with updates. The ripples of what had happened were spreading outward. Ross's team was probably already working on damage control, trying to figure out the best way to address what had happened without making things worse. Should Ross apologize? Should he defend himself? Should he say nothing at all and let the footage speak for itself? These were critical decisions that would shape how the public perceived the entire incident. Gervais's team was likely facing similar challenges. They'd have to decide whether to issue a statement, whether to double down on his behavior, or whether to try to smooth things over. Every choice came with risks and potential consequences that needed to be carefully weighed. The makeup artists who had prepared both men for the show were probably talking among themselves, sharing their perspectives on what they'd witnessed. They'd seen both Ross and Gervais before the show when they were still friendly and relaxed. The transformation from that state to the heated confrontation must have been jarring to observe. The reality was that the 46 seconds of explosive confrontation would now define this episode of The Jonathon Ross Show, overshadowing anything else that had happened that night. The other guests, the jokes, the planned segments, all of it would be forgotten in favor of the dramatic clash between host and guest that had ended with Gervais storming off the set. It was the kind of television moment that reminded everyone why live shows, or shows that felt live, were so compelling. You never knew when something real would break through the scripted facade, when genuine emotion would override professionalism. Tonight had been one of those rare moments when the unexpected happened, and it had been devastating and riveting in equal measure. As Gervais disappeared through that exit, leaving Ross standing on the stage trying to maintain his composure, it marked the end of more than just his appearance on the show. It marked the end of whatever relationship the two men had once had, burned away in the fire of their mutual anger and hurt feelings. Some things, once broken, can't be fixed, and this might have been one of them.